everybody. Thank you very much for joining us at this early hour in Europe and wherever else you are. Welcome to the Work Area 5 Building Passport Project webinar. We have 1 hour and quite a tight schedule to get through, but I'm very pleased to be joined by Nora Stoyer from the Global Alliance Secretariat today. She's very keen to welcome you all and will give us also a sneak preview of the 2020 Global Status Report of the Alliance. This sits, of course, very well with our topic because compiling the report findings is very heavily dependent on reliable data and information from the buildings, from the construction and real estate sector. So therefore, very timely. Nora, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ursula. A warm welcome also from my side. It is really a pleasure to be here, and I also really want to express our thanks to Ursula and to all our panelists for this timely topic. And Ursula's absolutely right. We need to get cracking on this. We need good building passports, good guidelines, how to develop them. We know we have several members, especially countries, who keep asking us about this. So we're so pleased that this is happening. As Ursula said, what I would like to do is give you a very privileged sneak preview. This is the very first time that we're speaking about new data from our not yet released 2020 Global Status Report for buildings and construction. It will be released on 16th of December 2020, so next week. If you're interested, do join us. You can contact us and we will share the link with you. It's a press conference. It won't be long. We'll certainly go more into depth in 2021, but it will be the first time we give you a comprehensive overview. And with that being said, I want to give you a couple of snapshots of what you're expecting. I will not give away the best bets because the best bets are kept for 16th of December, but hopefully it gives you a taste for what's about to happen. Next slide, please. Before I do this, a couple, for those of you who don't know us, and most of you maybe do, that's why I keep this short and sweet, about the GlobalABC. We were founded at COP21. At the heart of our agenda is really to give the sector a voice, because it is, as some of our members have said, the sleeping giant when it comes to climate action. We can't achieve the Paris Agreement without decarbonizing this sector, and for that we need reliable data. As Ursula said, our objectives are to be a global advocate, a catalyst to give the sector a voice, to be a trusted platform for setting targets and for tracking progress. Again, therefore, building passport is a vital ingredient, and to support countries in setting priorities, always based on their situation. Next slide, please. Now, here's a snapshot for you, and be mindful, first of all, the figures you see here, they're a little bit raw. So the nicely designed version is still to come, but what's important here is that the CO2 emissions from the buildings and construction sector are at an all-time high. They have increased even more. And I think that what's noteworthy about this, not just that they are in an all-time high, is also that they are in an all-time high despite us being in a global pandemic and a global recession, more or less pronounced, depending on where you look, which has impacted construction activities. They have gone down. So what this tells us that we really need to work much harder to look at this. Of course, this is from 2019, but still, we really need to be very active in lowering emissions. And what you see here, for those of you who know previous iterations of our Global Status Report, you see the 38% figure. So 38% of global emissions, global CO2 emissions, are from this sector. You know that last year we spoke about 39%. This lower percentage, this lowering percentage point, is because other sectors grew even more. It's not because the building sector lowered. Next slide, please. So this gives you a snapshot. I've already spoke about COVID-19 impacts, and the 2020 iteration of our global status report for buildings and construction. It's a little bit special because normally we speak only about data from 2019, but because this year has been so special, we do also speak quite a bit about 2020 and the impact of COVID-19. And we really see that we see a slowdown of buildings, of completion of buildings and construction projects. Of between 10 to 25%, depending on where you look. Here you see some select countries, and it looks more or less pronounced in other regions of the world. And this actually could result in embodied emissions being even lower. Again, this highlights, we speak a lot about ifs and could and would, and it highlights again that we really need much better data, and buildings passports are very, very helpful in this. Next slide, please. And this is a section about spending for energy efficient buildings. And I want to highlight this because this is actually more or less good news, because we see that for the first time spending for energy efficiency in buildings has picked up, has increased, but it's still outpaced by investment in conventional buildings and construction. And this is a pity, because it's really one of the best investment opportunities on sustainability is green buildings. And the International Finance Corporation agrees on this point and calls it a over 24 trillion investment opportunity until 2030. Now, what they also say is for investors to pick this up, of course, they need to know what's actually going on in the building, in the neighborhood, in the city, and so on. And again, for that, we need good databases. We need certifications that we can trust. And again, for this, building passports are so essential. Next slide, please. And I just want to highlight another tool that we have, which is our regional roadmaps. Many of you know this, which is a tool for countries more on a national scale, on a regional or national scale, to decarbonize the sector. And we have 8 areas: urban planning, new buildings, existing buildings, building operations. Next slide, please. Appliances and systems, materials, resilience, and clean energy. I won't go more into depth. I just want to say that this shows again our approach on decarbonizing based on a country situation. And again, I mean, for a lot of this, we need data. We have developed these roadmaps, and we've really discovered a lot of data gaps, not surprisingly. And again, building passports are so essential for that. Next slide, please. These roadmaps are now being implemented at the national level, among others, in Vietnam and Cambodia. And we're quite excited about this. And for the future, if we have building passports, we'll certainly include this as one of the tools. Next slide, please. This is it from my side. Again, please do join us for our launch, our press conference on the 16th of December at 3 p.m. Central European Time. If you're interested in doing so, for GlobalABC members, you've received the link. For anyone who's not a member who's on this call, you can visit our website, globalabc.org, or send us a message at global.abc@un.org. And with that, I would like to hand back over to Ursula. It's been a real pleasure, and very much looking forward to hearing from Ursula and the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Nora, for this preview and exciting news, of course, about the increasing investment, but you know, more still needs to be done, and this is where, of course, better data and information base can really help. And with this, I am handing over the baton to Jörg Ostermeier, who is the chair of the work area for building measurement data information. Jörg, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very, very much. I will make that very brief, not to stress the timeline too much, but also because I feel the good bits have all been taken already. Maybe we go straight into the next slide. The mission of the Work Area 5 at the GlobalABC is pretty straightforward. Basically, everything that we plan to do with buildings is dependent on data. And I guess that's why most or all of you are here. There is a profound interest in actually having more granular, more reliable data, be it to build strategies, verify progress, bank buildings, invest, assess the opportunities for innovation. Everything that we do these days at scale needs to be based on data, needs to be based on information in the form of digital processable information and numbers. Next slide. Our goals are also pretty straightforward. With data, we want to promote overall sectorial data transparency, consistency, and information exchange. In order to do that, we want to provide guidance to how to do that. And we are aiming to facilitate accessibility, transparency, and understanding on especially the comparability of energy use in buildings. Next slide. We didn't build that from scratch, obviously. The original starting point of the work area was a report pioneered by Ursula and the RICS, where we basically looked at the main gaps and demands of stakeholders in the built environment. And the really crucial points that were identified by almost everybody is, first of all, they need data, obviously, for very various reasons. They want it to be comparable, but most of all, they need a place to put it. So a lot of people say they have a lot of data, but it ends up somewhere and it is not accessible and it is not formatted in a useful way. So we see the efforts of building a building passport mainly as a central data repository. We are not promoting a single solution, but we aim to give guidance for how to make this an as widely used central data repository as possible. And with that, I also want to hand over, not to take also the best parts from the discussion round that will follow, and we'll hand over back to Ursula. Thank you very much.
Much, Jörg, for the seamless introduction of the building passport concept, and later on we'll also be looking at about the work of the task force and the project itself. So I'm very pleased this morning to be joined by our three panelists, Thomas Lützgendorf from the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, and Joel Todd from the Buildings Performance Institute in Brussels, and Kinley Della from King County in the United States. Thomas is director of the Center for Real Estate at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, and in his teaching and research activities, he's focusing on questions relating to integration of sustainability issues into decision-making processes in the life cycle of buildings. He's a founding member of ISBE and involved in standardization activities at international and European level. Jolt is a senior project manager at the Building Performance Institute. He's a part of the consortium developing the EU framework for a digital building logbook. And in parallel, Jolt is also involved in a Horizon 2020 project focusing on the future generation of energy performance certificates, which looks at the feasibility of introducing logbooks alongside PCs. Before joining DPIE, he worked on green mortgages on a wide range of built environment topics in the context of EU policy. So there's also a strong financing element in there. And then finally, Kinley is a program manager in the Green Tools Green Building Program at King County in Washington State, USA, where he manages the county's construction and demolition materials diversion program with an emphasis on material reuse, building deconstruction and design for disassembly. Before we start the discussions, I will briefly set the scene with the three questions that you can see on this slide. Next slide, please. Let's start with the what. What is a building size? The graphic on this slide, you can see that data and information flows within the real estate and construction sector are quite complex, lots of stakeholders, lots of demand, lots of data supply, and quite a few data categories. So this is basically our starting point. And what is a building passport? I mean, you've already referred to it as being a repository, a container. Essentially, it's a one-stop shop where we can store our data that is collected. Other data sources can be linked to it, so that it's not meant to be a database, but it's more like an information hub, somewhere where the information can be linked to, can be stored. Some of the data information will be static, some of it will be dynamic, depending on the nature of the data category. So basically, this can cover all activities such as planning, construction, design, operation, financing, insurance, transactions, dismantling data, and also, it stays with the building for the whole life cycle, and has a lot of, therefore offers a lot of benefits because you can tap into this data. So it's about data sharing, but it's also about having benefits from being able to use that data for your purposes. Next slide, please. So this brings us to the why. I think this almost is a rhetoric question because we've already heard from Nora, we've heard from York, and I'm sure that you are, as stakeholders in the built environment, you know that data is important to underpin all kind of decision making. It is, we need data for benchmarking. We also need data for certification. So, and also for policy making. And I think that in the recent past, we can see that there's been an increasing demand, through the adoption. One of the triggers clearly has been the adoption of the Paris Agreement, which has led to increased industry commitments in the form of ESG on the demand side, that there's an increasing demand for reliable data and access to data and more transparency. And this is really what the Building Passport needs to address and wants to address. So, and that's to the last slide, which is about who needs this data. And as you can see, this flower diagram in the middle, it pretty much covers all stakeholders along the life cycle, and from suppliers, policymakers, data providers. I'm not going to go through all of these because you can see them hopefully on the screen. But so every stakeholder at every stage of the life cycle needs building related information for various purposes, which you can see on the sides of the flower diagram. For planning purposes, cost management, compliance, inventory generation, product development, investment decision-making, insurance, valuation, operation, maintenance, and policy-making. And also there's a strong innovation element in there as well. So with this scene setting, I am now very pleased to also give the floor to our panelists. And I am going to kick off the conversation with the panelists in a minute, but before that, I'd like to explain a little bit how we're going to do this interactive session. If you do have any questions to the panelists or to me, please write those questions in the chat, and I will field those questions to the panelists you'd like to answer your questions. Right, so Thomas, you've been around on the issue of building passports for quite some time. It's something you feel very passionate about. Is this something radically new that we're talking about here, or has it started for some time? And if so, are there any lessons we need to learn?
So thank you, Ursula, for this very important question. I think we can learn a lot from the past to avoid mistakes today and tomorrow. And so in this way, I like to tell you the story. For sure, this is an international event, but I like to tell you the story from a more European perspective. You know, there are so many different concepts and names in place, like building file, building passport, home information pack, manual, electronic file, or digital logbook, but they are not so successful so far. There must be a reason for this, and let us think about this. So from my point of view, if we go back in history, since hundreds of years, we are dealing with building-related information. For each castle, for each large residential buildings, we are able to find building-related information also today. We are still able to find and still able to read the files related to such buildings. In some cases, the buildings is no longer there, but we can still find its file. But today, we are running into serious problems. But for a lot of buildings in use, we have no information available. So there is a certain problem in relation to this. Since 30 to 40 years, we have a campaign in Europe to improve the transparency in the real estate markets. Especially, we like to deal with the hidden characteristics. So it's a must to be able to send out signals of quality and to allow the clients to look for very specific characteristics. So in a certain way, the targets are to avoid adverse selection, to motivate the owners, to support actors involved in the process of renting or buying a flat or a house, and to support a fact-based decision-making. The only result so far was the energy performance certificate, but this is just a partial solution. So we can see any kind of activity was on the supply side. And what are the reasons for the problems in the past? There was no real demand, no real consequences in the case of missing information, no willingness to pay or to order such a building passport. There was also no willingness to offer one. There was no exchange of information along the supply chain, and there was a very unclear situation dealing in relation to the character of such an instrument. It's a manual, an assessment system, or a collection of information. Now the situation is improved because there is now a very clear job sharing between assessment system and a container of information, like you like to call this. And there was another problem from my point of view. Most of the approaches are much too specific, but we have to take into account the needs of all the actors and stakeholders. That's why we have to ask for the long list of building-related characteristics. Today, and more or less this are the happy part of the story, we have a better situation. Now there is a real demand. We have additional demand for additional information like environmental performance-related data. There is a clear impact on risk assessment and economic valuation. And now we can use methods and approaches of information management and digitalization. And today, it's a global issue. Personally, I'm also collaborating with my colleagues in Australia to think about the electronic passports and similar things. So this was my short look backwards, and I hope my younger colleague Zsolt can provide you with a more optimistic view into the future and the advantages and progress we are making at the moment following the current activities. So thank you, and this was my first short statement. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that perfect handover to Zsolt, who's obviously been involved in a study on digital building logbooks for the European Commission. And as a part of this work, Zsolt, you looked at a number of building passport type initiatives. Can you tell us a bit about this work and how does the Global Alliance initiative fit into this?
Yeah, thank you, Ursula, and good morning, everyone. Yeah, only good things to come in the future, but unfortunately, my perspective is still exclusively from Europe. So yes, we are just about to wrap up this 1 year long study, which looked at a common definition, a common framework for the digital building logbooks. And we also along the way try to identify a series of policy recommendations for the European policymakers and legislators to take action in this direction. And I think setting a common framework was a very important initial point, because Thomas has already pointed at the fact that there are quite a number of similar initiatives out there. Some of these are market-led, others are more public initiatives, and there's just not enough clarity, and it can, the overlap of so many different initiatives with very different focus, scope, as well as stakeholder audience can just confuse the market. And ultimately, the logbook in itself is not going to accrue all these benefits that the previous speakers have been already talking about. Now, what has changed over the last couple of years? Because it's true that the idea of a building passport was also in sort of on the tables of the European Commission for a couple of years now. So it's not a new idea, but there have been a couple of recent policy as well as market developments, which I think prompted the European Commission to take more concrete action and initiate this work. And clearly the need for future-proofing the building stock, that it's one of the main issues. But with that also, I think an increased attention to circularity. And just complying with both of these objectives is very data intense. The other important aspect, and because our study has been hosted by the construction units from within the European Commission, there was an obvious focus on the construction sector, and an obvious focus on innovation and unleashing the digital agenda. And this is where I think the logbook is also it's a very important aspect, where if you have a seamless transfer of information, data sharing, all these data silos are able to communicate easily among themselves, it can actually kickstart innovation, new business models, and new services. And we no longer just look at the data, but we look actually how we translate this into valuable information and insights. And actually that's very important to overcome these barriers that Thomas has been talking about. And finally, there is clearly the sustainable finance taxonomy and the increased demand that will come from the financial sector. And this is a global initiative, so this is not just related to Europe this time around. And there is a clear need for transparency and to be able to document and to prove alignment with climate mitigation, as well as to show that you are also significantly contributing to a number of other environmental factors. Now, just to wrap this up, how this fits the Global Alliance work, how this fits with all the ongoing initiatives. I think what is really important about this guidelines that you have working on is that it puts forward a very compelling case for a whole life cycle approach. We looked at around 40 existing initiatives, and in a way you can argue that they are all somehow partial concepts of the logbook, but if you tweak them a bit and open it up to the entire life cycle and wider stakeholder group, again, I think what is very important, that a whole range of new benefits can be realized with the logbook. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel, for this comprehensive overview, and also acknowledging the value of promoting a whole life cycle approach, which is obviously also something that Thomas mentioned, the need for a long list that will also enable more stakeholders to use and to actually contribute to the building passport. And with that, you mentioned the word circularity, and obviously circularity has a strong element also of reuse. And with that, I'd like to bring Kinley in on the discussion. Kinley, why did you join the Building Passport Task Force? What was the motivation behind it, and how could the rollout of building passports help you with your daily work and with the objectives that you have? Kinley, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I work a lot on design for disassembly, encouraging architects to design buildings that can be easily remodeled or eventually taken down in a way that the building materials can be reused in the best way possible. And one of the biggest problems that we run into when thinking about this concept is trying to figure out how to let the people who are taking the buildings down in 100 or 200 years know the best way to take the buildings down. Buildings are really complex these days, and there's a lot of great advances that have been made in building assemblies, and there's a lot of ways that buildings can come apart, and it's not always intuitive. So how do we get that information to the people that need it 100 or 200 years in the future? And as I started looking around, I realized that I came across the building passport concept that you guys were working on. And it was a great fit. It makes so much sense to be able to capture that data when the building's being created, and then as the building's being modified over time, and have that that information readily available at the end of the life cycle for that building, so that those materials can best be captured and put into new buildings, hopefully. And then at King County, we have a sustainable climate action plan. We have a lot of buildings that we manage. We're building 1 or 2 new buildings or large infrastructure projects every year. We have a large portfolio of existing buildings, and we've been struggling on trying to figure out the best tools to use for managing those projects. We have a pretty good instrument in place for new construction. We have a good way of monitoring or materials that are going into the new projects and looking at various aspects of it. But once the project is completed and the tenants move in, or the transfer station is used, or the wastewater treatment plant goes into operation, the part of it kind of gets stuck on the shelf, and nobody ever really goes back and look at that. And then I've been involved in several projects that are retrofit projects, and if it's only been 20 years or 15 years in some cases since the structure was built, nobody really has good information on what happened or what the purpose was. So the building passport is going to be a great tool again for figuring out how to work with our buildings moving forward and to really get all that information in one place. Ursula.
Well, thank you for giving us also that end of life perspective, which I think is often neglected. We always talk about design and at the beginning of the life cycle, but what you're basically you're at the end of it. You need that information that is generated at the beginning. We do actually have a question here from Kevin Yee. What is the panelists' view of how to engage with the market so that the data and information from the building passport or digital logbook is actually fit for purpose? Who would like to take this question? Who wants to go first? Any volunteers?
I can.
Yeah, Jolt, and then France.
Okay, great. I think this question actually focuses on a very important point, and the successful uptake of any building passport initiative is, I think, dependent on the fact how well you articulate the benefits that you are able to claim with the building logbook. Because of course, if you look at the building logbook, it has a number of elements. So the data sharing and the data storage that York has been talking about, that's more like the back end side. That's more like the data infrastructure that is behind the logbook, but that's not necessarily something that the stakeholder engages with or the market generally engages with. So it's very important, all the features and all the benefits, all the applications that you build on the back of the availability of the data. That is, I think, very important to be done well, and that probably will help with the uptake of the building logbook. The other issue, I think, is so for the rollout of the building logbook, this clearly relies on an accurate stakeholder mapping, just to understand, who provides the data at what point, who needs the data, and also I think you need to build the business case on the fact that you can add more value from sharing the data than withholding the data, which is unfortunately still very much the existing practice in this sector.
So I think I can add something. So the idea to be fit for purpose is the most important requirement in the case of building passports. But at first, we must be sure to see the long list of different purposes. We can also call it use cases. And there are so many different use cases in a life cycle of a building, like, let us say, renting or selling, or to finance, or to insure, or to undertake appraisal, or whatever. And that's why the idea of this concept here is to identify all of such use cases, to identify the demand for information, and again, to create the long list of information to be able to, let us say, provide any kind of user, any kind of use case with useful information. That's why it's a more or less comprehensive approach. And we have to make sure that we are able to follow the life cycle with the building related information. And again, our last colleague in the panel was able to make sure that we have to follow the full life cycle from now to in 100 years. So we must also not just store the information, we must also adapt the information and transform the information to be able to fulfill the requirements. That's why fit for purpose, yes, but there is a long list of different purposes, and we have to take into account this very specific situation for buildings. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And we have one more question here, and that unfortunately will need to be the last question I can actually field to the panelists because I'm conscious for time. It's a question for, it's not necessarily a question for Kinley, but it's about what he said. He said that, ideally, if the building passport is used to provide data to inform people in 100 years' time of how to demolish buildings properly, to increase material recycling, how can we address the challenge of getting the data accessible in 100 years? Yeah, we do have written data on, big stately homes and castles, but not necessarily, they're all in paper form. That's fine. But if they, if they've been burned on in the process, it would have been very difficult to, to do like conservation measures. So, for example, if we have floppy disks, they don't work anymore. So, then that would be for colleagues of Kinley in 100 years' time. That would be very difficult. So I allow myself to bring York in on this quickly. Because on the sort of the data availability, the data availability side of the future, York. Just very quickly, how can we solve this problem for Kinley's colleagues in the future?
I think actually that will not be the biggest problem that we are facing, because if, sticking to the floppy disk example, if we would have continued to work with the data which was once on the floppy disk, it would now be somewhere in the cloud. But I think the question is valid from a little bit different angle. What we do not know is what kind of information people will need in 100 years, what technology they have, what options they have in order to demolish a building, and what information or material they need for that. I think that's the much trickier question. I think the technical question is a question. I think it will solve itself when there's continuously work done on the data, when it's really in a live data repository. That will solve itself. But 100 years ago, people, as you said, were collecting data on buildings. They collected all the data they felt they would ever need. And the problem that we have now is stemming from the situation that we now need data which people 100 years ago could not imagine that we would ever need, or even 20 years ago, or 30 years ago. People were not imagining that we need to radically decarbonize. Why should they document well the decarbonization and refurbishment potential? It's a valid point. For the said purposes.
Yeah, I am. I think I have got one more question. If we can do this very quickly, I think it's very important that we also listen to our audience. Yeah. So in terms of the last question, Kinley, we need the crystal ball to to inform us what data your colleagues need in 100 years' time, because as you're sure this can radically change. And I think therefore that is also an argument for a very flexible, dynamic approach for building passports. So you need to be able to add on new data categories as time goes by. One last question before we move on to the last part of the webinar. How can we motivate homeowners to take part in this initiative? Thinking about residential buildings here, how can we do that? Because if there are residential, there's, for instance, where I live here in Flanders, there is a woningspas, a building passports for residential buildings. So how can we motivate them? Who wants to take this?
I can go first again. Yeah, so I think it's the same question again, that we shouldn't look only at the logbooks, but what they represent and what they can enable. So I think you have coined the point that the logbook is actually, can act as a one-stop shop for all the data going in and around the building. But I think it's also, the logbook can be a key data source and data sink for even wider concepts of one-stop shops, like the ones that are providing technical assistance, helping homeowners to renovate, advising them with the right sort of renovation sequence and available financial tools and companies. So again, it's the services and the applications that you build around the logbook. I think these are very key, focusing on the benefits and the real needs of the residential building owners is probably the key for the uptake of the logbook.
Thank you, George. And I think,
Yeah, I was just going to say that I've begun discussions with our local residential green building incentive program, talking about credits for using the building passports for residential construction. The first step.
Excellent news there. And I think what we're increasingly saying is that, of course, a well-documented building represents a reduced risk. That also, so there's value in the information and documentation itself, and it's easier to also ease conveyancing processes. So when you're actually trying to sell and buy, so in fact you have everything in one place, so you don't need to go down into your garage and try and find the documents from 30 years ago, which might have been lost in the last clear out. So I would like to thank the panelists for a really good, lively and informative discussion. And with this, I would like to move on to the actual project that everybody here, the panelists, were involved in and are still contributing. Very briefly, I'd like to say what our objectives were. Next slide, please. In fact, the objectives of the guidelines were to explain the concept and the approach to a wider audience, and to help build capacity for developing building passports for various stakeholders, and also ultimately, of course, to help widespread market transformation through greater levels of transparency, digitization of the data, and also, I think Joel mentioned it, the opportunities for developing of new innovative tools and business models. Next slide, please. You, please. Oh, hope it's not frozen. Well, in any case, I'll continue talking. We have, in terms of its scope, it's global and inclusive. You've already seen that we're taking a whole life cycle approach here. We're not just focusing on one aspect of the life cycle or one particular issue. We are covering building types, so it's not just for commercial buildings, but also for residential buildings, so it's not discriminating any building typology. But we're also, of course, are very conscious that different markets, different stakeholders have different starting points, and that means also that different data categories may not necessarily apply in every market where you might be. We have been supported here by our expert group within the task force. The task force consisted of Global Alliance members and external experts covering finance, development, construction design, insurance, waste management, research, circularity, policy making, certification, and material suppliers. So a very good representation of life cycle stakeholders here. So about the actual guidelines, we have basically the guidelines are separated into interconnected parts. So for the first part of the guidelines deals with an introduction to the building pass, very much based on what we've been discussing here today. So why do we need building information? What is a building passport? And we look at different formats, types, and the interoperability. We're also looking at extensively at the building passport benefits and drivers, because as Joel said, it's absolutely key that people understand what the benefits are, so that we get the market engaged and we also get homeowners engaged. They need to understand what the benefits are. The benefits they vary greatly depending on which stakeholder category you belong to, but there are many benefits. There are, of course, also a few barriers, but they get covered in part 2 of the guidelines, where we look at the practical application and the implementation. So how does that work? How does it actually work in practice? And what kind of recommendations do we want to give? Do we want to give stakeholders who might want to implement building passports? And we also have in an annex, we have an overview of the building passport initiative. It's very much building on the work that Jolt has been doing with the Commission. And we would like to get more real-life examples of the building passport. Currently, we only have one in there, quite extensive. It's the Flemish building passport, which is also operational, which is nice because through that we were also able to get some first feedback on do's and don'ts. Yeah. Next slide, please. So in terms of what we've covering in the guidelines, so we're looking at data sources, storage options, ownership issues, quality and verification issues, how data is being captured, data categories, how data is being inputted and provided, data protection, big one, how data is exchanged, and also, what kind of demand there is. So, and with that, we're now moving to the more creative part of this webinar, where your input is also required, and hopefully you are happy to contribute. You've all received the first consultation draft. The plan is that whatever feedback we are getting from these 2 webinars that we are holding today will then flow into the second draft of the consultation, which then will be made available to a wider audience and on Monday. So on the next slide, you can see a couple of questions. I don't know whether you have had a chance to read the guidelines already. If you have, maybe you might have already some feedback for us in terms of structure, coverage, clarity, level of detail, the examples, geographical balance, and maybe also additional work that we might want to reference. Opening the floor here in the chat. So if there is any feedback, it's your chance to give it now in real time. If you haven't had a chance yet to read the guidelines, then of course you're more than welcome to provide this later via email. Just otherwise put it in the chat. One of the really interactive bits that we've been planning today on the next slide is, now you've heard all the benefits, the history, the initiatives, also like, a testimonial from Kinley, how he can actually how he's promoting the use of building passports, and how he's actually he would be a real beneficiary. And given your backgrounds around the table, the virtual table here of participants, we would like you to put in the chat, either you do this with your organization or you don't. You could put in the chat why you think building passports can help you with your work. Or your organization. So don't write a novel, just a few lines why you think this could help you, and how be a benefit for your work. You have got, let me just check where we are in terms of time. So I give you 5 minutes. 5 minutes break now to write down how this could help you. We have a break, and you can do this now in the chat. Much activity there now, but we would really like to testimonials, more testimonials, why this is useful. So you could also then help with these testimonials. We can obviously highlight the benefits even more. Well, there's some movement. Thank you. I mean, obviously, for those of you who might want to think about this a little bit more, or might want to first read the guidelines, you can send us your testimonials afterwards by email with your overall feedback. So, and we're also conscious, of course, that you don't have so much time to think about it, but we have a few comments here. That's excellent. Thank you very much. I mean, you can still keep going to put things into the chat, but I'd like now to outline, just give a brief outline what the next steps are. Can I have the next slide, please? So what we're doing now is this really marks the official start of the consultation period on the guidelines. We will have another webinar this afternoon with a different set of participants and also different set of panelists. Then on Monday, Alliance newsletter will be published, and so the guidelines will be pushed out via the newsletter and also via social media. What I'm going to do today is that on the basis of the questions you've been raising and also your comments in the chat, we will look at the guidelines as they stand today and then try and integrate as much as we can. So there will be a consultation draft 2.0. The consultation period will last until the 22nd of December, so you've still got time to provide your feedback, and then we'll finalize the document by mid-January, and then there will be the launch somewhere in the first quarter of 2021. With this, we're getting to the end of our webinar. I'd like to thank everybody for the participation. This webinar has been recorded, and I hope you found this interesting, and I hope you will engage more on this topic. I'd also like to thank Nora for her introduction. I'd like to thank the panelists for joining us here this morning. And I'd also like to thank the task force for all their contributions to the guidelines to date. And I'd like to also finally thank the Global Alliance for their support of the project, for facilitating these webinars, and for really believing in the value of the concept of building passports. And with this, I'd like to close this webinar. I wish you all a good day. Stay safe and healthy. And if there are any questions, can I have the last slide, please? You can always contact contact me and send us some questions that you may have or some ideas, or York, which is on York's email address, who's the chair, is on the next slide. These slides will also be shared, so you can you don't need to write things down. So thank you very much, and hope to see and hear you again soon. Thank you.